Welcome to Hotep-ish, intelligent-ish talk, intelligent shit talk, where we balance the profound with the profane. Yes, I'm a comedian, but I'm also an advocate. Yes, I make people laugh, but I also make you think. That's what we're here for, because life is 360, fun and business. On the line, we have a very special guest. I first found out about him on the Rock Newman show because I love that show, because anytime Rock Newman has a guest on, it's something I got to learn. And this brother taught me a lot. Taught me a lot about what's going on with Africa-China relations, what's going on the continent, what's going on in Cuba, what's going on right here at home in the United States. I want you guys to welcome to Hotep-ish, very, very, very special guest, Mr. Obi Egbuna. How you doing today, brother?
I'm fine, brother. How are you?
I'm great, man. I'm just really excited to have you down here. You know, I really am glad to have you here. I'm honored to have you here. Because
the honor is mine, brother.
You do, and you've done the things that I say that I look up to. You know, you're out there, you're authentic. You've done the work on many different levels, whether it could be education, when it comes to, you know, relationships. You're out there. You do it. And I really, 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 really am honored to have you on, because you're somebody I really, really want to pattern myself after as I get, you know, deeper into what I do. You know, you really help people, and it's nothing to be, I have nothing but 100% admiration and respect for you, my man.
And it's definitely mutual. And thank you so much for extending this platform to us this evening. And we hope we meet your satisfaction as a host and the satisfaction of your listeners.
Yes, man. I appreciate that. So before we get all the way into it, tell the guests a little bit about your background. You know, how we got here, and where did you get started?
Okay. In terms of organizing, 30 years, specifically at the moment. The U.S. correspondent to the Herald, Zimbabwe's national newspaper. Mm-hmm. I've been in that capacity for 12 years, but I've been writing for the paper for 14. I'm a children's history and theater playwright. I'm the co-founder of Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company, and I have written 24 plays in 9 years. 20 of them have been performed. 4 of them were supposed to be performed for African Liberation Day this year, but obviously with the global pandemic, that's not going to happen. It may happen later on in the year. I'm an African history teacher. My targeted demographic is K through 12. I've been teaching for 30 years. And so I'm a teacher, I'm a children's playwright, and I'm a journalist by skill. But I'm a traditional grassroots organizer that's been in organization since I was 20 years old, and I just turned 50 in October.
Oh, man, see, that's what I'm talking about. That's a long track record of out there doing it. And that has to be very interesting, you know, working with Zimbabwe. And you're there during interesting times, you know, with everything with Mugabe. You're right there. That's something that we're gonna have to get to and talk about at another time. But today,
yes, we will.
Today we want to get on into it. What we have on today's broadcast. Mm-hmm. Can you explain for me how you got involved in the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association and the special connection between those nations and people?
Yes, I most definitely can. 14 years ago, when I had the honor and privilege of touching Zimbabwean soil for the first time, I was there, and the very first place I went was to the Cuban embassy in Zimbabwe. And the reason that I went there is because the Cuban ambassador to Zimbabwe at the time was an African brother named Cosme Torres Espinosa, dear brother, dear friend. He has the distinction of being the highest ranked Cuban diplomat to ever be deported from the United States, which happened around 2003 for false charges of espionage.
Wow.
So when I went to Zimbabwe, I wanted to pay him a courtesy visit, him and his lovely wife, Lourdes. And as soon as he saw me, he said, "My friend, how long are you there?" And he thought I may be there for a couple of weeks. I said, "I'm going to be here for 6 months." And he said, "You must join Zimkufa." And that's the acronym for the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. What that represents is the special bond between the Zimbabwean and Cuban people. The highlight of that relationship are a few things. In 1984, the late Pan-African giant and icon, Comrade Robert Gabriel Mugabe, received the Jose Marti Award, which is the highest political honor that someone can receive from the Cuban government. He was the second African head of state to receive it. Thomas Sankara, the late president of Burkina Faso, got it first. Nelson Mandela got it after them in 1990. So that's one thing. But on a people-to-people level, between 1986 and 1996, approximately 3,000 Zimbabwean teachers went to Cuba to a place called the Island of Youth for training. And that is the reason that today, as we're having this conversation, Zimbabwe has a 97% literacy rate, which is the highest on the African continent. So we can thank Cuba for that. So that's the relationship between them. And a few years ago, I had the honor of being appointed the External Relations Officer. And my responsibility is to do work with our people throughout the diaspora, primarily the Western Hemisphere, to build bridges between our people in the Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, Central America, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the peoples of Cuba and Zimbabwe.
Now, you said that, and that what you said a lot. I want you to say that one more time. Zimbabwe's literacy rate is what?
97%. And yes, I said that at the time where 8,000 children drop out of school in the United States every day, and U.S.-born Africans, commonly referred to as African Americans, represent 10.5% of that demographic. That's 3.5 million children a year who drop out, and that's about 350,000 of us, usually glossed over as the school-to-prison pipeline when discussed. So yes, you have a nation in Africa, because of Cuban training, that has a 97% literacy rate.
And I had you bring that up because, you know, here in the United States, we're either miseducated or not educated at all as to how other countries in the world works. Here in the United States, we're told that Cuba's this place that's behind, and they still have these old cars from the 50s, and Castro was the worst person ever. And those people in Zimbabwe just want their land back, but they're wrong for that because they shouldn't do that. And you're telling me that the country that is so-called, quote-unquote, to the Western world, primitive Cuba, has helped another, quote-unquote, primitive nation get a 97% literacy rate.
Yes, sir. That's exactly what I said.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted that because oftentimes people here in the United States, we get on our high horse about so many things, and you know, something like that needs to be discussed more and highlighted more because
most definitely
that's what's really going on. And talk to me a little more about that the Cuban Zimbabwe relationship.
Those would be the main highlights, and of course, both of them are victims of Western diplomatic terrorism. Since after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where the United States, using the vehicle of the CIA, tried to reinvade Cuba and reestablish the Batista network, Cuba's fighting army fought them off in 3 days, 72 hours. But immediately after that, on the heels of that, the Kennedy administration imposed a crippling monstrous white supremacist blockade on Cuba. And the purpose was to crush the economy, because to echo the sentiments of Kennedy, he said what made Cuba so dangerous to U.S. interest was not just its ability to maintain its revolutionary direction, but it would inspire other nations in the hemisphere to follow its courageous example. And he wasn't wrong, because when Salvador Allende and the Chilean people had their revolution, the CIA crushed it.
Mm-hmm.
When we had the revolution in Nicaragua, where you have the largest African population in Central America, after 70 years of the Somoza family running that country with an iron fist, the CIA rose up and crushed it. When that great son of Africa, Maurice Bishop out of Grenada, assassinated by the Reagan administration in 1983, 39 years old, same age as Brother Malcolm, same age as Dr. King, when the FBI and CIA put bullets in their head and in their chest and everywhere they could. They did that because of the relationship between Grenada and Cuba. So, and you see them going after Venezuela with reckless abandon, because Venezuela has patterned this revolution after the Cuban Revolution. So anyone who wants to move in that direction, you can move in that direction, but know that you will have to go up against the full brunt and the full might and the full maliciousness of the United States government, U.S. imperialism, regardless of whether it's Democrats or Republicans.
Yeah, and that's I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that a lot of people don't understand as far as why certain nations around the world are quote unquote poor. It's because of lack of trade. They can't trade. Same thing with Zimbabwe when they had the Reappropriation Act. Now all of a sudden a bunch of sanctions come back down around, and if you can't trade,
yes, exactly.
If you can't trade, you can't participate. If you can't participate in the world economy, you're not going to have the means to feed your people adequately and get enough resources adequately.
And to quote former U.S. President Barack Obama during his first inauguration, he said, "The might of our military must be matched by the strength of our diplomacy."
Mm-hmm.
So, meaning that if they cannot bomb you, if they cannot assassinate the leader, they will try to starve you to death. And it takes a special blend of resolve, a special blend of unity, and a special blend of purpose to resist this level of repression.
Yes, and it takes that, and in that, within our Cuban and in our Zimbabwean brothers, we see that, and we salute you. We salute you, and especially when you go back and look at the Cuban Revolution, it's just so much to be admired from that, But moving on, before we get into the appeal. Highlight some key projects you have been involved in pertaining to Cuba, which, if I'm correct, 25 years worth of work?
25 years worth of work, yes. We came to the same way that Paul Robeson said he found Africa in London. We found Africa while we were working. We found Cuba while we were working on the Million Man March 25 years ago. Congratulations to the Nation of Islam under the leadership of the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, the incarnation of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. At the time, we were in an organization called the Pan-African Student Youth Movement, and we helped organize the National Day of Absence and Day of Action, meaning that for those who could not assemble in Washington, like we did 1.5 million, 2 million strong, we had made sure people did not go to work that day and did not go to school that day. So we evoked the spirit of the great Lucy Parsons.
Hey,
so
Paul,
right around that...
1 second, just one. I don't mean to cut you off.
It's
but
okay.
To listeners, I was in school. I remember that. I didn't know that was you, dog. For real. I was in school, and I remember not going to school and participating in that. He been here in L.A., and I remember that. That was that was a really big thing, and I felt like I did something being a part of that. I didn't know that was you, man. Thank you for that.
Around 5 million people followed that example, because we were looking at the concept of the general strike. For people who don't know the history of Labor Day in this country, the reason that it's celebrated, this is a sidebar, but we'll bring it back to what you asked.
Yes.
The reason that it's celebrated in September is because of President Grover Cleveland, because on May 1st in 1887, there were marches simultaneously all over this country by white workers who were protesting the 14-hour workday for $1.25 a day. And when they did it in Chicago, the Chicago Police Department had plainclothes police officers pose as demonstrators, throw bricks and bottles at the police. They shot into the crowd, injured several people, killed several people. So the next year, simultaneously, they were supposed to be demonstrations planned around the world in solidarity with those workers. And that initiative was organized by an African woman named Lucy Parsons.
Right.
So we were looking at that as the model of the general strike. Also, when you look at the African Revolution, Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party of Ghana, who came to independence in 1957, March 6th, they used what Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference called positive action, strikes, demonstrations, and boycotts to overthrow their British colonial ruler. The next year, in 1958, Ahmed Sékou Touré and the Democratic Party of Guinea used positive action, strikes, demonstrations, and boycotts to overthrow the French colonial empire there. In 1960, Patrice Lumumba and the Congolese National Movement used the tactic successfully again for revolutionary purposes, though, overthrowing Belgian and French colonialism. And in September of 1969, Muammar Gaddafi and the Jamahiriya, the People's Revolution in Libya, used the same tactic. So we were looking strategically and tactically at how to use a strike of that sort to send an emphatic statement to the masses of our people. And this was 3 years removed from the mass action by the youth of 1992 in response to the police terrorism we saw in Los Angeles. So we knew that through a concerted effort, we could make an emphatic statement. And one of these days, real soon, we will share our full history in relationship to that. We don't have a problem with being overshadowed by those who were assembled on the ball, but understand that our people are capable of having a general strike inside United States borders. All it takes is cohesion. All it takes is communication. All it takes is a certain level of objectivity, us appreciating what all our organized formations bring to the table.
That's really big. You said us appreciating what each one of our organizations bring to the table. Look, people, and this is for the listeners, oftentimes everyone wants to play team ball, get on team, this versus that. They see things as a competition. It's not a competition. Every group has its specialty that it's good at and things that it's not good at. The whole point is for everyone to work their specialty, to work their vision, and to work as best as possible and be strong within who you are within yourself and within your organizations. It's not a fight. And when we understand it's not a fight, we can go further. Go ahead.
And forgive me, I didn't even get to answer your question. Yes, indeed. We were introduced to a man named Jose Ponce Carabello, who is in the National Communication Ministry in Cuba to this day. And he was deported by the United States government as well. And he was an African diplomat, a Spanish-speaking African born in Cuba. However, so since then, let me just highlight some things. Between at the end of 2013 to 2016, we co-produced 3 albums of music with M1 of the internationally acclaimed hip-hop group Dead Prez.
Yes.
It was called the Battle Cry for Cuba and Zimbabwe Project. Over 100 songs of music by artists all over the world, cross-generational and multi-genre, artists creating material calling for the lifting of the blockade on Cuba and the sanctions on Zimbabwe. In 2011, I wrote a children's play called Cuba's Greatest Army, a tribute to the Cuban doctors. Last year, one of my students who I've been teaching since he was 12 years old, Zion Yutzi, who's a spoken word artist, created a video called Vision, and it was paying homage to Cuba and Venezuela's work called Operation Project Miracle, which is a medical campaign to eradicate blindness and glaucoma in the Americas. In 2003, we persuaded the Cuban diplomats in Washington to celebrate African Liberation Day and have a reception every year so we could use that as a platform to build a united front amongst our organizations who would work to end the blockade. Since 2000, since its inception, we have been campaigning for young people to take advantage of the medical scholarship program at the Latin American School of Medical Sciences in Cuba, which was initiated 20 years ago as a memorandum of understanding through the Congressional Black Caucus in Cuba, where 500 youth every year out of our community, out of the Native American community, and out of the poor Caucasian community was supposed to go to Cuba, get a scholarship worth $250,000, 6 years of study, and they would come back to the poorest parts of this country and practice their medicine. Let me see. We got the American Medical Student Association's chapter at Howard University to host a special seminar December 1st, 2005, about something that Comandante Fidel Castro was ready to do. He said that if the resources were ever available, Cuba would deploy a 4,000-member HIV/AIDS brigade to Africa, and they would remain on the African continent until HIV/AIDS was completely eradicated. So as right there, those are just some things I wanted to highlight. I hope that's enough for the listeners to get an idea of our consistency and our service in relationship to Cuba.
Yeah, wow. Talk to me a little bit more about the Cuban doctors in that program. I've always been super interested in that program right there that they have.
Well, it's you have to look at it in a couple of ways. I say because one of the things many people misunderstand Pan-Africanism. They think that when you talk about it, you're talking exclusively about the African continent. No, we're talking about the diaspora as well. And we say that because in relationship to Cuba, when you look at their medical work, you have to look at it in the context of what the Africans in Cuba have endured since they got there. And they got there for the same reason that we're here. As we know that what is commonly referred to as the slave ship is the first form of public transportation. So when you look at it from that vantage point, many people make the error of reducing their understanding of Cuba to Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, and of course they must salute both of them. But if you know U.S. history, you know that the first 7 presidents of the United States tried to annex Cuba. You know that what is called the Spanish-American War in your history books was really between 1868 and 1890 was a fight between Spain and the United States over who would annex Cuba. And so the same way that they annexed Texas and California from Mexico, the same way they illegally occupy the Virgin Islands today, illegally occupy Guam today, illegally occupy Puerto Rico today. So it's the same concept, it's the same motivation that was behind that. And they were 300 uprisings by captives, commonly referred to as slaves in Cuba. The most successful one by an African warrior named Jose Aponte, and the Spanish responded by beheading him and putting his head at the port of entry of Cuba to intimidate the other Africans to see if they could stop the flow of rebellions. So the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the UNIA had 40 chapters in Cuba. The first all-African political party in the Western Hemisphere, Partido Independiente de Color, which means independent people of color, was established in Cuba in 1908, 1 year before the NAACP, 1 year before the birth of Catherine Dunham, 1 year before the birth of Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, 1 year before, in 1909 when W.E.B. Du Bois launched a campaign to develop Encyclopedia Africana and help create the NAACP. So when we look at it from that context, and then when you look at the doctors, especially when you look at it in the context of the fact that this was right around the same time in history that our people in this country in 1896 created the National Medical Association because of racism, we could not join the American Medical Association. And then when you look at the early 1900s, Booker T. Washington established National Health Week, and Du Bois did a journal called The Physique and Health of the Negro American. So when we know the history and we contextualize this, everybody knows what needs to be known.
Yeah, that's it.
And we'll know what needs to be known.
Yeah, history and context means so much versus this linear thing of things that used to happen back in the day. When it's taught in context, you get a greater understanding of how it can be used right now. And with that being said, you have an appeal. Why an appeal and not a petition?
Because we want to be historically obedient. An appeal in the tradition of David Walker and the Walker's Appeal, which all our people must read. In the tradition of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who in 1923 made an appeal to the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. In the tradition of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and his historic appeal to the United Nations in 1947, which First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt ironically being on the board of directors of the NAACP, did everything to stop. And of course, 1965, what Brother Malcolm did not get a chance to do, thanks to the FBI, CIA, and the New York Police Department, and what would have made his appeal epic by 1965, he would have had sovereign, independent nations in Africa marching in step, ready to support that. So based on that, we wanted to move in that direction. We wanted to honor that tradition. And appeals target organizations, institutions, and networks. Petitions target individuals. Organizations and the masses make history, not individuals, regardless of how quality their contribution to history may be.
Okay. And tell us a little bit more about the appeal that we have on deck.
And the appeal that has been made is an appeal urging the United States government to do four things. Number one, get out of the way and allow the Cuban medical personnel, doctors, nurses, and other specialists to come to the United States and make a contribution to the efforts to eradicate COVID-19, SARS, CoV-2, work to provide training to doctors, nurses, and other medical personnel in this country who are not used to functioning in the midst of a pandemic. Number three, urge the United States Congress and the Senate to grant the American Medical Association, National Medical Association, and the Black Nurses Association permission to work in conjunction and harmony with the Henry Reeves Medical Brigade, which is what the Cuban medical personnel that come abroad are called, once they arrive on U.S. soil to assist in the fight to eradicate COVID-19, SARS, and CoV-2. And lastly, urge the U.S. Congress, Senate, and the White House to allow COVID-19, SARS, and CoV-2 victims on U.S. soil access to interferon alpha 2b, which was developed by Cuba's Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology. This would be a measure to be in concert with the other 45 nations who've made a formal request for interferon alpha 2b based on its proven effectiveness as a form of treatment. So we are dropping this appeal strategically in three different pockets tomorrow morning. And we have a plethora of organizations, networks, and courageous individuals who have stepped up to the plate and are supporting this effort.
That's good to hear. That's really good to hear. Who are the strategic targets of the appeal and why?
The strategic targets of the appeal are the Congressional Black Caucus, the National Conference of Black State Legislators, and the National Conference of Black Mayors. And, for obvious reasons, for many of our people who believe that the vote is the most effective outlet of political expression, we're going to test the waters and see how determined these people who we elected, and they're only there because we shed our blood, not because of their individual excellence. We're going to see how much temerity, how much integrity, and how much courage they have, and to see if they can match the intensity of the people who want this better than ever. We say better than ever because people must know. 20 years ago, some of you remember a baby boy, beautiful baby boy, 7 years old, named Elian Gonzalez, was kidnapped to make a political point in this country. That was my first trip to Cuba. And I had the honor of participating in the Organization of Caribbean and Latin American Youth Conference there. And Comandante Fidel Castro, during that process, made his first public comments about the Elian Gonzalez situation. And he said the effort by our neighbors to the north to try to score political points using a child backfired. He said it backfired, in his humble opinion, because the average U.S. citizen learned more about Cuba in 4 months than they did in 41 years. And we say since this pandemic has come to U.S. shores, the average U.S. citizen has learned more about Cuba's healthcare system in the last 3 weeks than they have in 55 years.
And that's
what does that mean?
Go ahead.
Yeah. And the irony is, this idea is the brainchild of a young man named Obi Egbuna, who is right now part of the emergency response team, COVID team at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. He graduated from the Latin American School of Medical Sciences 3 years ago. Not only that, he started an organization when he was in Cuba called the Organization of African Doctors, that all the young people of African descent, whether they were born in the 55 nations on the African continent, born in Jamaica, born in Barbados, born in Belize, born in South Bronx, born in Southeast San Diego, born in South Central Los Angeles, if they're down there, they're part of that organization. That is the organization that is one of the primary pushers of this appeal.
Okay.
Yeah. And so it shows that it wasn't just a question of, going there, but they come back and they're working. He's already working, and he's just a resident, and he's advising the doctors because he got that training in Cuba. And one of their biggest nightmares is not only will we get the medical training, but you're going to come back with a sense of purpose. What does that mean? More Daniel Hale Williams, the first person to perform open heart surgery in this country. Mm-hmm. More Charles Drew. And their worst nightmare, more Frantz Fanon's, a very critical player in the Algerian Revolution, who was a medical doctor. Mm-hmm. More Steve Biko's, who put his medical career on hold to start the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. More Che Guevara's, who was a medical doctor. More Augustino Nito's, leader of the Angolan Revolution, who was a medical doctor. More Samuel Paranatywas, who was one of the leaders of Zimbabwe's National Liberation Movement before he was assassinated in 1962. And the National Hospital in Zimbabwe, Paranatywa Hospital, is named in his honor. More Samora Machel, who before he led the revolution in Mozambique was a nurse, just like Harriet Tubman. Mm-hmm. So they understand what has, and not only that in terms of choosing a certain historical path, you have to look at Cuba's relationship to certain crippling pandemics in our community. When you look at the fact that it was declared by the World Health Organization in a meeting with all the African presidents in 2010 at the United Nations that they said between 2010 and 2038, they were expecting approximately 57 million people to die from non-communicable diseases. Those are diabetes, heart attacks, strokes, pandemics, and strokes, cancer, what have you. And they said that NCDs have surpassed cholera, AIDS, and malaria as the number one killer of the human being. And you realize the reason that people are panicking from the corona pandemic is because people who have these medical ailments, they're the most vulnerable, and they're the ones dropping like flies. Yeah. So they're saying the reason that the NCD number has risen is because when a pandemic hits your nation, if you're afflicted with these problems to begin with, this is where this affects you. And the numbers are now coming out that we are the overwhelming majority of deaths since this pandemic has hit U.S. shores. And what we are saying is we want to go back to the traditional definition of America. America is not North America, it's South America, it's Central America, it's Latin America. And since all of our people are in the Americas for the same reason, we're not going to let linguistic barriers stop us. We don't distinguish between cutting sugarcane in Cuba and picking cotton and tobacco in Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, or Maryland. We're together, we're one. And this gives us a chance to make one of the strongest stands we have made on the question of health. And we must think outside the box. We're not going to confine our maneuvering. We're not going to confine our activity to the lovers' quarrel, the never-ending lovers' quarrel between Democrats and Republicans. Africans got work to do.
Yes, you do. And speaking of Africans have work to go, you mentioned a lot of great names, but one name in particular I did not know was in the medical field was Stephen Biko.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit more about him.
Well, he's the founder of the Black Consciousness Movement, and that was launched by the South African Student Organization in 1968, following the example of Black Power in the United States and Black Power in England and Black Power in Australia and what have you. So they came with Black Consciousness. But yeah, he was in pursuit of a medical degree, and as a matter of fact, his scholarship for his studies was terminated because of his political activity. And if he would have rebuked his organization and divorced himself from the struggle, he would have been a doctor. Very similar to how the former mayor of Marion Barry, the first chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, passed up a PhD scholarship in chemistry to be the first chair of SNCC, and are we glad he chose SNCC?
Oh, yes, we are.
I'm
glad you brought that up about Marion Barry, because people want to label him for one thing, but he has a long track record of great things that he did. And when you deal with all the things that he dealt with in his life, if he slept up and did what he did, so what? People want to talk about, Roosevelt was a heroin addict, so but they don't like talking about all that.
No. We'll do one better than that. Some of our best contributions have come when we were in pain.
Yes.
Wasn't it a heroin addict named Billie Holiday that sang a song called Strange Fruit? And brought more attention to lynching than the writings of Ida B. Wells, who wrote 2 books, Southern Horror and The Red Record, and more work than Du Bois, who dedicated the Crisis magazine to the crusade against lynching. What are people talking about?
For people who think hip-hop is new, the first one to protest, look, when Billie Holiday did Strange Fruit, she was banned for performing for years. She couldn't work it in nightclubs because she performed the song about lynching. And they use that song to ban weed and all these different things.
Yes, we make our contributions. Some of our best contributions have been made while we are going through anguish and pain.
Yes,
there's no question there. So we don't worry about when people go into that, and especially since many of the critiques come from people who've never touched the front line a day in their life.
Yes, you're right. Never touch the front line a day in their life.
And won't.
How can the people help? How can we help push this agenda forward and move it forward?
Karen Bass, the highest-ranking Democrat on the Congressional International Relations Committee, she's right there in L.A.
I'm glad you called her because I have her number in my phone because I have spoken to her before.
Matter of fact, and because of that, Dewan, we're going to ask you to serve her. Drop this on her tomorrow.
Yes.
Let her know that we are serious here. And you notice what we did. We didn't just focus on the Congressional Black Caucus. Many of our people don't focus on the National Conference of Black State Legislators. Mm-hmm. They play more of a role in the formulation of policy. Mm-hmm. And, of course, we have more mayors right now than we've ever had in our history.
Yes.
And we let them off the hook too. You can even look at the movement against police terrorism inside U.S. borders.
Yes.
We do a lot of protesting, a lot of spontaneous uprisings, but we have never had a sit down with those mayors. And if you look at this contextually, mayors have the same relationship to police that presidents have to militaries. They're the commanders in chief.
Yes.
So the question then becomes: is your loyalty to your army or to your constituents? And in that same vein, are they going to, and matter of fact, the mayors can become freedom riders, and they can fly to Cuba and go and get interferon alpha 2B and bring it back to their cities. No question about it.
All kinds of options.
I was talking to Dr. Ali Muhammad about that former Minister of the Health and Human Services of the Nation of Islam, who now has his clinic. He's one of the co-sponsors of this appeal. And he was saying that. And we're going to pose that to our brother Raz Baraka of Newark, the son of the great poet Amiri Baraka, who got national acclaim for his essay, Cuba Libre. Goes. So we're going to tell him to follow his father's example. Get on that plane, go to Cuba, come back with a symbolic suitcase or a big satchel of interferon. They bring crack into the country, they bring heroin into the country, they bring amphetamines into the country. We can't bring interferon alpha 2B? Please. And then think about it like this, going back to, as we put this in the context of Cuba, when I was there, I was hanging out with a brother, I'll never forget his name, Jean-Luc Compré. He was out of Haiti, and he was studying medicine in Cuba. And he said, you know what, my brother? He said, everyone asks me, compare Cuba and the United States. He said, that's simple for me. He said, Cuba comes to Haiti to save our lives. The United States comes to take lives. That's what he said. Mm-hmm. And so even when the United States wants to try, because they call Cuba's work medical solidarity. So when Cuba went to deal with the Ebola virus, in Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea 4.5 years ago ran circles around Doctors Without Borders. Not even that it's a competition. When the earthquakes hit Haiti, they don't even want the Red Cross to touch them in Haiti. They say, my doctor's on the way. Don't worry about who my doctor is. In Africa, the same thing happens all the time. And they function, and this is the other thing they're concerned about. You know that through this year return movement, Kufa Ado, who came out the womb hating Kwame Nkrumah, his uncle and granduncle helped the CIA overthrow Nkrumah in Ghana. And Nkrumah was the first president in the world to acknowledge the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, in case people never knew that.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
So, yeah. So what ends up happening here is he just pocketed $1.9 billion because of the tourism. And now with more people talking about investment in Africa, why can't we begin to invest through the African Union offices in Washington and the UN mission? Why can't we invest in Cuba's medical work on the African continent? Are people going to go to Ghana for the purpose of exploiting the Ghanaians to cause tension between our people in the diaspora and people in the continent, where their communication with the Ghanaians will be in these three prepositions: clean my toilet, cook my food, water my plants? Or will we invest our money in Cuba's efforts? And remember, in case people don't know, this is what the Cuban doctors do in Africa. When they're not in the poorest parts of the countries treating the people, do you know what they're doing, Brother Dewan?
What are they doing?
They are training the future doctors of those nations, and the only ones they train are those who sign a contract that they will remain in their countries after the Cubans have trained them. So they're not coming to Washington, they're not going to France, they're not going to Germany, they're not going to New York, they're not coming to Los Angeles. They're going to stay in their respective nations and break the cycle of which one of our biggest problems is the brain drain.
And that's the exact opposite of imperialism. That's coming in and spreading it.
Yes.
You're not taking advantage of people. You're educating them and leaving them to their own devices and leaving them to help their own people. And
the other thing about that too is this appeal also is a direct challenge to popular culture. It sends an emphatic statement. We don't look at Cuba through the eyes of Brian De Palma, who made Scarface, which was an anti-Cuban movie. Many people don't know that, and I'll explain it. The original Scarface was made in 1932 by Howard Hughes about Al Capone. How does it all of a sudden change in 1984 to focus on Tony Montana escaping from Cuba? If you look at the beginning of the movie, it's a speech by Comandante Fidel Castro talking about the Mario boat lift.
Yes.
Where the people there who were part of the blue collar crime wave in Cuba, when Lucky Luciano used to run heroin from a Sicilian doll factory to Havana to New York City, where Meyer Lansky had casinos all over Cuba, whorehouses all over Cuba, heroin spots all over Cuba, and they transformed that. So the people who were still part of that effort, they removed them from Cuba and they sent them to Miami. And in 1983, Reagan gave the speech for an organization called the Cuban American National Foundation, which in conjunction with two terrorist organizations, Alpha 66 and Brothers to the Rescue, are responsible for 635 assassination attempts on the life of Comandante Fidel Castro. On 635 attempts, he was supposed to end up like Medgar Evers, end up like Malcolm, end up like Martin, end up like Lumumba. But the Cubans were able to escape it, and they were able to protect Fidel like he deserved to be protected. That's why we're so happy that Asada Shakur is there, as they say in baseball.
I was just about to bring her up.
100% safe.
I was just about to bring her up.
Safe.
It's like,
but and then if you look at it, I mean, the propaganda for many people. So people who didn't know Scarface, and we know how the hip hop community glorifies the movie Scarface. That's an anti-Cuban movie.
Yeah.
Godfather 2, this Hyman Roth, the fictional character, is really Meyer Lansky.
Okay.
For those of you who are boxing enthusiasts, in 1984 there was a fight in the Orange Bowl in Miami. Like 100,000 people were there. between Aaron Pryor and Alexis Arguello.
Yeah.
Those who know who Alexis Arguello was, one of the greatest boxers of all time, he was from Nicaragua. And he was originally a supporter of the Sandinistas, but he was bought off by the United States. And the reason that they had that fight in Miami, because the Sandinistas developed a very close relationship with the Cubans. So the gusanos, which means slimy worm in Spanish, wanted to use that fight to make a political statement, and that's why Aaron Pryor beat the hell out of Alexis Arguello. It hurt them. It hurt them that night. So they used sports against Cuba. They used film against Cuba. But now people see Cuba through the lens of their doctors. People see Cuba through the lens of their teachers. People see Cuba through the lens of their engineers. And also what I was saying, what these young people who we're encouraging to go there, following my nephew's example, when they come back to the United States, they're automatically going to improve the lifestyles of our elderly. At a time where through real-life Lego, commonly referred to as gentrification, they have no problem putting up a Planet Fitness and tearing down a senior citizens home. But we will take care of the elderly, because Cuba has the lowest infant mortality rate in the world. Wow. That means our babies will be taken care of better than ever. Because many people feel that Cuba may be the first country on the verge of finding a cure for cancer. We will develop leaps and bounds in that area, because they have the lowest HIV/AIDS rate in the world. So it is through their medical personnel that they are showing our people the importance of and the essence of what revolutionary spirit is all about. And they are a poor people. I use the word poor because many people make a mockery of it. As we are having this conversation, Brother Dewan, they are 2,470 billionaires, according to Forbes magazine, worth around $9.5 trillion. And at the same time, they are 784 million people on the planet that live on $1.90 a day or less. 400 million of them are in Africa. Of the 25 poorest nations in the world, 22 are in Africa. And for those of you who believe in the amputated narrative of the African experience and are going to say, well, what about here, brother? We ain't going to leave you out. We are 21% of the poor in this country, even though we're only 12% of the general population, which is inextricably linked to the fact that we're 43% of the homeless. So we are the poorest people on the planet. So for those of you who focus on generational wealth, remember what Frantz Fanon said: wealth is not the fruit of labor, but the result of organized, protected robbery. This is why King said we're trying to redistribute wealth, not accumulate wealth, because if your focus is the accumulation of wealth, then your main goal is preservation of wealth. And that's why we got 4 African billionaires in this country, U.S.-born Africans, commonly referred to as African Americans, but we 21% of the poor. So the question is, are we trying to escape from poverty, or are we trying to organize to eradicate it?
That's a great...
It's as simple as that. And Cuba gives you a sterling example of how to move ideologically and how to move methodologically. And what's so beautiful about this is what their medical personnel is doing is a classic example of how you articulate ideas so people embrace those ideas, but then feel the obligation and motivation to execute those ideas. And I say that to all our sisters and brothers who spend all their time on social media competing in the tongue Olympics.
I have a question for you. How does one, like, say here in America, is there any way we can find a doctor locally that graduated that program, maybe whether it be private physician or in local hospitals, or are they? They're
all over. They're all over the place. We're gonna connect you with the brother who's the founder of the Organization of African Doctors. He's right there at Grady, and he's got the list of them all over the country. They're active. They still meet. They still move. When they're not treating the sick, you know what they're doing? They're going to high schools. They're going to middle schools, encouraging young people who have a propensity for science, a propensity for math, usually in these STEM programs, who, if we don't grab them, are going into the military, are going into the FBI, are going into the CIA, are going to the police department. But instead of that, let's get them to Cuba.
Yeah, because I would love to put that on my website, resource for people to go and look up.
We will introduce you to the director of the program.
I appreciate that so much.
Oh, that's what we're here for. Well,
yes,
we're here to work,
for
brother. You know that.
We're here to help. We're here to help.
And we want to thank you for the meeting, and we have all types of support for this appeal, but one of the people I'm most proudest and honored to work with, and thank you so much, Brother Dewan, and to our brother Jermaine Shabazz. We know you're out there listening.
Thank you,
Special
Jermaine.
shout out.
Thank you.
Jermaine was so instrumental in the circulation and distribution of the appeal. And when people see it, Brother Dewan, because you're going to post it tomorrow, I know that, I want people to know one thing. We did not use Facebook. We did not use Twitter. We did not use Instagram. We did underground emailing, phone calls, talking to different organizations. And when you see the organizational representation we have, we want this to be an example. We're not going to come out here and condemn our younger fighters. We're going to give them the practical example. Now, but I wanted to give a special shout out to our sister Ada Rodriguez, who you had on a few weeks ago.
Yes.
Who has agreed to work with us every step of the way to push this through. And she said, when we do our part, let her know so she'll be ready to do her part. And we want to wish a happy birthday to her daughter.
Her son.
A happy belated birthday to her son.
Yeah.
And so we thank you. And we did the initial part. Now we're ready to come to you, and we're ready to move this thing at a very intense level.
Yeah, I want to thank you for that.
And I want to say one more thing about that, because people ask me, so this happened before. I said I had to tell people no, it didn't, because if you go back 15 years ago to Hurricane Katrina, Cuba offered to send 1,500 environmental disaster doctors, nurses, and medical personnel whose specialty is dealing with environmental disasters, floods, typhoons, hurricanes, tornadoes, and cyclones. They have a medical brigade that comes in just for that reason. And they were not, the misperception is that they were rejected by the Bush administration. They were not rejected. They were ignored. They were ignoring. They did not tell them no. They just didn't pay it any mind. And we were more focused on Kanye West stating the obvious that Bush doesn't like our people. And we could have formed a human circle and snatched them through U.S. Customs. And they said, they were ready to remain in the United States until the pandemic was eradicated. I mean, until the public hospitals in the Gulf region were back to normal. And if anyone knows anything about those public hospitals, they were the two worst in the United States at that time.
They were the killer kings of that area.
They offered, when D.C. General in Southeast D.C. was closed down, which left the poorest part of the city without ambulatory care or a level 1 trauma center, they offered to come there.
And they weren't. See, that's why I hear people.
But what I'm saying to you is the difference is that a few people said something. But right now, we have this appeal. There's another petition pushing interferon alpha 2B. There's a push in England to end the blockade. There's a movement with an appeal in Canada and the Virgin Islands, just like the one we have here. And we've merged forces and are going to be working together.
See, and so what you have here, listeners, is a chance to do something, a chance to make a difference. We've been doing a lot of complaining about the coronavirus, and we've been talking about the lack of tissue and talking about Trump and what he's not doing. And look, politics is more than waiting on an election every 4 years. Politics is what you do every single day. And right now, we all have an opportunity to contact our local congressperson, our local state representative, and our federal representative to have them sign on to this appeal and have them look at this appeal. I'm going to post this appeal on my social.
Have them have them act on it.
Act on it. That's it. Thanks for the correction. They have them act on it. And in the spirit of what you were saying, you just brought a smile to my face. This is what we need to do as a people. Let's leave the horror stories to Stephen King and Jordan Peele. We're going to fight. We're going to fight.
There's nothing, that no odd is insurmountable. Our history has proved that. Our illustrious history of struggle shows us we make the impossible possible effortlessly. All we got to do is organize.
All we got to do is organize. Thank you again for that, Obi. We only have a couple seconds left. We're going to post the appeal. I'm going to post it on my social media tomorrow. Is there any way they can contact you or get in where you are?
All of that will be up there. And one of the other things that Jay was planning a tour for us of the West Coast, but primarily the LA area, because we're looking to build branches of the Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company. And the next time we come on, we'll talk more about that. But tonight we wanted this platform exclusively for this purpose. It's an emergency. It's a necessity. And we thank you so much for the platform.
I thank you, and I'll definitely have you back on when we're ready for that. In the meantime, people...
I hope what we shared tonight met your satisfaction, and we hope your listeners are pleased as well, because we're very humble. We thank you.
I appreciate that. And people, there's something you can do. Look out for my social media tomorrow, hotepish.com, Dewan B on YouTube and Instagram and Twitter, DWANNB. And remember, there are no perfect messengers, only perfect messages for those who are willing to pick up game. We out. Thank you.